Hello, and welcome to another episode of Surroundscapes, the podcast that covers various aspects of the pro and installed AV industry, sponsored by Bluesound Professional. We talk about all sorts of topics, covering things like hot topics, partner, Q&A for technical stuff, and case studies. This one is a hot topic with a friend of mine from many years ago, Roland Hemming. We've known each other for decades now, and I followed his career with great interest. So I think this will be an interesting, free-ranging discussion covering lots of different aspects of our industry. So welcome, Roland.
Oh, well, thank you very much for inviting me. Looking forward to it.
It's a pleasure. I'm not sure why we haven't had you on earlier, actually, but you're on now. So let's start by covering your career in our industry right from the beginning. How did you get into the AV industry?
A very varied career. It started at the age of 14. I was very lucky that I went to a school that actually had some facilities, some sort of recording facilities and things like that. And there was just this notice on the notice board of this sort of teaching assistant who worked there, who sort of ran that bit, and it said course in sound. If you want to learn about sound, do join at lunchtime. So I turned up, and I was by far the youngest person there. All the rest was sort of, in their last 2 years at the school, and it was all the fundamentals: how does sound travel through the air, what a dynamic microphone is, all of those things that I still use now. And then this guy also ran a folk music program, of all things, on the local radio station. So I then started going out with him and recording bands in sort of heaving pubs in the middle of the countryside. And then I progressed and did lots of things there, and volunteered in other hospital radio and other things like that. And I always just thought it was going to be a hobby, and I'd have a proper job and then do sound in my spare time. And he and some other people said to me, you do know people do this for a living, don't you? And so that's where it all started. So then I decided didn't want to go to university, and I got a job working for a rental company called Theatre Projects, which at the time was a very well-known and quite prestigious company, and it was very much in its heyday. And I started in the warehouse, coiling cable, and then they promote you to like being allowed to test equipment, and then you start doing get outs on shows, and then you start doing the shows, and then you start operating the shows, and then you start designing them. And that was 7 years at Theatre Projects, really learning the basics, and how to do things. And then I went freelance for a few years, and at the same time I also had a very big interest in MIDI and things like that. And so I think in about 1989, I approached the management at Theatre Projects and said, look, we could be doing show control and things like that. So I started writing computer software to control shows. And I was very lucky at the time. We just merged with Verilight, which again, at the time, they were this monster lighting company. And I met this man called Richard Bleasdale, who very sadly died last year. And he was writing software to control the Verilight and to automate that. And then I was working with him. So I was doing sound automation. He was doing lighting automation. I was using a program called Max, which you may have heard of. And I actually shipped the first commercial software written in Max. And it was a program called Theatre Sequencer. And you could control dozens of MIDI devices, and it got used on some West End shows and big sort of car launches and things like that. And pretty sure no one said that they did it first, that we were the first people to fade delay times. So we were using Yamaha delay lines and sending them, rather than sending them a preset, we'd send them a delay change to position performers on stage. And that would have been about 1989, 1990 that we started to look at that in a very abstract way. And I started to create some visual tools to do that. And then that carried on. And to be honest, I then went freelance. And by the sort of mid certainly to the mid to late 90s, I was never a programmer, and people who were better at programming than me were starting to come out with stuff, and it wasn't really where I was going to go. So I gave up on it. But what was funny was Richard Bleasdale at the time, and we even had a company together and things like that, was sort of offering show control solutions. I remember him showing me his lighting software playing video. And he said, "Oh, look, I've got this playing video." And my famous comment that, I was, telling people, after he died was, well, I said to him, "Why on earth would you want a lighting program playing video?" And of course, this is the man who then went on to create the first ever media server. He was the father of the media server, and Catalyst and Pixel Mad and all of these things that, basically lighting is video now and video is lighting. So even though I think quite often I've been able to sort of, spot the zeitgeist, in that case, I definitely didn't spot that all video and lighting were going to be closely related. And then I had an accidental conversation. I think about 1990, I'm trying to think, 1996, 97, where this guy phones me up and says, "What are you doing next week?" And I said, "Nothing." And he goes, "You've got the easiest job in the world. I can't do it. It's basically go and look at a lighting and sound system on a cruise ship. The entertainment company who are supplying the sort of visiting acts just want to check it's okay because this company is new to cruising." So anyway, I trot out there, and all I was meant to be doing is looking at the spec and measuring the dressing rooms and things like that. But it was chaos. It was chaos. It was this company, they'd never done cruising before. The DJ had spec'd all the performance systems, and I didn't have to do anything. I wasn't working for the cruise company or anything like that, or the holiday company that was rented the cruise ship. And I just started chatting to this guy at one point, about 2 o'clock in the morning, while another disastrous rehearsal was rolling on into the night. And I said, "It doesn't have to be like this." And he goes, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, you have people who design sound systems, you have lighting designers, you have production managers, you have, people who do this." And it turned out he was head of cruising for the holiday company. And he basically just put me in charge of it. And I'd not done installs at that stage. I'd only done live events. So I then very quickly did a very, very steep learning curve into what the difference between installing stuff permanently and particularly within the confines of a cruise ship was, and doing live stuff. Anyway, it worked out, and then the next year I did 3 cruise ships, and suddenly I was doing fewer live events. And then I was coming home in 98. I'd been away on a cruise ship for a while, and I was just going out that night on a train journey, and I picked up all the magazines that had gone through my door, and one of the adverts said, "The highlight of your career." And it was for the job for being head of sound at the Millennium Dome. And for those of you who don't know the Millennium Dome, the British government put on by far the largest celebration for the new millennium of any other country. They spent basically $1 billion on the whole project. And they needed a head of sound. And by hook or by crook, somehow I got that job on being in charge of the largest audio installation in the world. We had 804 network signal processors on it. We had, we were using a megawatt of power just for the audio, 57 different sound systems, the 2 largest cinemas in Europe, a Cirque du Soleil type of show, exhibition zones, broadcast, everything. And so, very steep learning curve. I was 29 years old when I got the job. And that basically, made me a name. There was a lot of, publicity about the Dome project. But in terms of how it moved the audio industry along, we invented the first networked intercom, not because we wanted to, because we had to, just because the sheer distances involved. We created the first networked active loudspeaker, again, without thinking about it, just because we had to. And that sort of, if you like, defined my career in many ways.
There's so much to talk about there. I'm fascinated by your start. I mean, I had a similar thing at school. I kind of got involved in our stage crew doing sound and sound effects for theatre, and then actually with folk music as well from the university. And so it's interesting to hear those parallels, and it's fascinating to see how it all kind of unfolded for you. But I mean, I'm curious because back in the day, I saw an ad to be head of sales for Neve consoles, and I saw it in the back of a magazine, Studio Sound, I think it was, and I thought I couldn't possibly do that, and so I didn't apply for it. And then I saw who they actually got to do it, who was someone I knew, and I thought, oh, I should have done that. You know, I might have been in with a shout. But evidently, you had no such doubts. Kind of applying, seeing that job, you know, opportunity of a lifetime, and saying, "Okay, I'll apply for that." Was that difficult, or did you?
I mean, they sort of listed the requirements, and I sort of said, "Well, I've done that, and I've done that." And, you know, so I'd sort of done most of the things they seemed to be looking for. And then when it got to the interview, I think they just wanted someone who'd had a bit of broad experience, because not many people had done live and install. And the fact that I had both of that, I think, was helpful. And they asked every single possible question about, you know, have you worked with acoustic consultants? Have you done this? Have you done that? Which nobody had done all of, but I think they just wanted someone who, on aggregate, had done a fair number of different, you know, types of thing, and dealt with, you know, regulation and risk assessments. And, you know, remember, you know, a lot of the job wasn't about sound. In many ways, I felt my job was to protect everybody else from all the tedious, you know, and this was a government project, so very tedious paperwork, to let them do their job. You know, I was there hopefully to enable others to do lots of sound, and well, I didn't, or really why I defended sound, or explained sound to people who didn't know about sound, in order to allow us to do what we needed to do.
Yeah, I remember that made me very proud to be British at that time, seeing what the country did for the millennium. And I'd already moved over here. I moved over to the US in '98, but my wife and I came over and saw it, and it was truly amazing. So let you continue on your path, because it's such a fascinating one.
Yeah, and then I had, you know, I think the worst part of my career, where I made a bad career choice. I moved too quickly. I was too worried about what I was going to do next, and set up a technical division for this entertainment company, which, you know, was fine. You know, one of the contracts we won was the Wembley contract. You know, it wasn't, you know, bad in that way, but for various reasons I wasn't happy. And then I came back from holiday, and just, it suddenly dawned to me. I was sort of sitting on the bus and wrote my resignation, and then suddenly I was freelance as a consultant, and I didn't know really what to do. I knew I had a sort of place in the industry, but frankly, I didn't know what it was. So I had lunch with lots of people, not asking them for work, but just saying, where am I? Who is this sort of person who's done different things in the industry? What is my role? And then the phone started ringing. And then, you know, I got, you know, jobs. I helped manage, restructure companies and installation companies, you know, installation department. I started to work on Lord's Cricket Ground, which the company wanted basically someone to sort of help with that. And I'm still working at Lord's Cricket Ground more than 20 years later, because it's one of those gifts that keeps on giving. There's always a bit that needs redoing. It's not a conventional stadium that has a nice bowl that you replace every, you know, 10 or so years. And then I got involved with compliance activity. I sit on a lot of standards committees now to do with voice alarm, life safety, things like that. And then at around, it was 2011. I got a phone call from the London organising committee for the Olympic Games to manage the audio project on behalf of the organising committee. So I had this job title, which is sort of venue technology manager audio, which basically means you're sort of audio across all venues. So it's all PA, so to speak, except ceremonies. So it was about 400 sound systems. And basically the year was, you had a spreadsheet for each venue, which each was about 50 items. Has it got a design? Have we worked out the cable routes? Have we got the radio mic licenses? Have we got this? Have we got that? Whatever. And slowly across the year, going from red to orange to green, across about 50 items across 40 venues, and sort of basically helping enable that together to happen. Ceremonies was a funny lot because they were their own bubble and did their own thing, but technically what happens is they do the ceremony and then they hand the system to me for the athletics, because then it becomes part of the thing, and then I technically hand it back. But obviously the practice of it is I have nothing little to do with it at all, and they just ran it. So that was great, working on another sort of mega project. There were lots of parallels to the Dome, very process driven, and it's sort of, the Olympics is interesting because it's planned like an install, but obviously executed like a live event, which it is. Lots of very funny stories to sort of dine out on, both with the Dome and the Olympics, where you just end up doing the weirdest things that you never expected. The Dome, we had to go up Big Ben to put our own microphones, because they couldn't guarantee that we were going to get the sound of the bells at midnight when we had the Queen and the Prime Minister and other people. That, just bizarre stuff. The weirdest sound check I ever did was in the Olympic swimming pool, testing the underwater loudspeakers. But because that's a system for the athletes, whereas I'm qualified to say whether a system is okay for the public, I can't say whether it's suitable for an athlete. So you actually have to talk to the athletes. So for various systems that need PA for the athletes, so gymnastics, equestrian, whatever, but synchronized swimming, whatever. So our sound check was done with the Team GB synchronized swimming team, and it's just like the weirdest thing. And I'm sort of swimming doggy paddle in the Olympic swimming pool, and then asking these girls, "Does it sound okay for you?" And just situations you just never thought in your life you'd be in.
I have, again, several questions to ask you, because this is, you're covering so many fascinating areas. My first question is like a geeky one, which is, how did you get the sound of Big Ben to the Dome in a low latency way?
Microwave link.
Okay, that's cool.
It's bizarrely a bizarre thing we never knew. Top of Big Ben is line of sight straight down to what is now the O2. Who'd have thought it? What are the chances? Wow. It's line of sight.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I remember years ago we did a line of sight thing. I can't even remember. I think it might have been to do with CobraNet, but at a trade show. And again, it was I think it was with Whirlwind, actually. It was, yeah. The next thing kind of I want to cover was something that really interests me, and I've talked a lot about in various podcasts, which is to do with the relationship between the creatives and the technologists. And I believe that in our industry, particularly in the installed part of the audio industry, we kind of operate in a separate bubble to those people. But in the events industry, and especially in the video part of the events industry, that doesn't happen, because the show has to go on and you have to make it work together. And you've got people like Laura Frank with her work in Framework, bringing together technologists and creatives. And I know you've worked with my great friend Liz Berry, who
indeed
has some of the best stories in the world. But it sits at that same kind of that intersection between creatives and technologists. And I just wonder what your experience was of that, and how we can get better communications in the installed, particularly the installed audio part of the industry, because I really feel that's lacking. And I think we'd see a lot more innovation, and we'd be a lot more relevant if we had those conversations.
Yes, but I think, unfortunately, your technologists thing, I think, goes further than that. If you're talking to installers, all they are trying to do is get a project over the line and fulfill their contractual obligations. Have we done the bare minimum to do what's needed in order, frankly, to get paid so we can go home at 5 o'clock? Mm-hmm. Whereas a sound engineer on a gig, I've got an extra half an hour that I can EQ the system more. We'll take that time. And so, fundamentally, unfortunately, a lot of installers are frankly like working with builders.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you have is a bunch of people who are building a house and another bunch of people who are putting on a show, and it's partly cultural differences, but it's actually unfortunately sometimes contractual, whereas there is no incentive for these very talented people to want to be more adventurous, more creative, whatever. They've got a spec, they've got a contract, there's risk, there's things like that. Why do something dangerous? I say dangerous in the broader sense of the word, when I'll get paid for doing the same thing, and that's, I think that's where the problem lies with it. There's nothing is set up to allow these people to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see it. I mean, it's something I've talked to Avixa a lot about, because even our trade association doesn't really foster those connections. Our trade shows don't foster those connections as much as I think they should. But it's interesting. I hadn't really thought about the integrator side of it, but I can definitely, now you've mentioned it, I definitely see that kind of thinking and the limitations of that. The other thing I wanted to ask you before I let you kind of go on from there is, when you do these mega projects and you basically take, I don't know, a year out of your life to do, say, the Olympics, how do you get back into doing your normal projects? Because you've kind of been away from your clients for a year, and you kind of have to wave your hand and say, "Hey, I'm back again. You could give me jobs again."
I mean, to be honest, it only happened once with the games, where I just made a decision of, look, this is a once in a lifetime thing. I'm never going to have the games in London again. It was a one-off. With the Dome, it was fine me ditching everything else, because that was nearly 3 years, and so it's not something I would necessarily do again.
Right.
I'm not someone who, I know some people who go from mega project to mega project and whatever. So yeah, that didn't really apply to me. I just took the risk that a year out to do something once in a lifetime was worth it. And yeah, most clients stayed or were happy, for me to deal with afterwards.
So pick it up. You've just finished the Olympics, and
Finished the Olympics, and then went back to consultancy. As I said, really, then it really started to go the way of doing. I mean, I was doing all sorts of stuff, helping, as I said, more almost sort of management consultancy, and really then it started to go back into more conventional audio consulting, lots of stadiums and arenas and things like that, and inevitably once you do that, you're then dealing with life safety systems, just because it's all combined on that scale, and big networking projects. And again, so it's not about being known for doing stadiums and arenas, but they are the majority of projects that are complicated. And generally what I do with my colleague Richard is we do projects that are either complicated either technically or politically, where you just need a couple of people who've been around the block a bit, and can sort things out in, as I said, whether it's a project management thing, which is more me, or a technical design thing that's Richard. And then we started then doing some product development for people. I'd done some stuff from about the mid 2000s, where manufacturer will get you in, and quite often it's quite a short consult. It might be 2-3 days, and in fact, indeed, years gone by, we did something like that, where you sit in a room for a few days, end up with 200 post-it notes on the wall with some idea and some concept, and we've done that quite a few times for people, and it's nice. And then something very strange happened. We end up at the end of the 2-3 days, go, right, okay, so you've got this new product concept or new product that you're going to develop, and we'd say, so how are you going to sell it? And then a couple of them said, well, maybe you could help with that. So I started doing marketing. And because I knew the industry, I could write, I understood how people perceive things and read materials and things like that. So completely by accident, we started doing bits of marketing for pro audio companies. And we even then took someone on who was doing sort of graphic design and brochures and other things, where we were providing the technical input, and they were like then packaging it together into something that was nice. And then by about 2016, it was becoming untenable, because it was getting bigger, and I was working with had a friend, colleague, Kira, who obviously well, and we just said, look, I didn't want to lose the work, but I couldn't have it as part of this hardcore technical consultancy. So she merged her clients, I merged my clients, and we created a new company that we, now 10th anniversary that we own to this day, which is a sort of specialist sort of AV and audio marketing company. And we always thought it would be a little sort of side hustle with sort of 3-4 people, and it's now a team of 25, and it's one of the larger agencies in the industry. And I think one of the things, it's not the only thing that has made it successful, is the fact that the agency is sort of, well, my knowledge is there, but also the consultancy, sorry, is there, where we can provide technical input into it. So we've always said it's sort of marketing about the engineers. You don't have to explain what different networking protocols are. So you need to spend less time hand holding us, but also hopefully we've got a bit more insight as well. And that was completely unexpected. And again, that's using my brain in a different way. And I think if there's one thing, looking back on my career, which I hope is no means over, but it is the fact that it's always been different things to occupy my brain, right from the time when I sort of approached as quite a junior person at Theatre Project, saying, what, we could do some automation here. And they sort of gave me a rope to hang myself on, and we started up the first sort of MIDI rental department, or show control rental department, I believe, anywhere in the world. And I'm now thinking, I've got permanent employees that I've never really had. They're having babies. They're things I've never had to think about in terms of long-term, care and nurturing a company. And so it's nice using my brain for that in a completely different way. So that occupies some of my time, and the consultancy still continues. And that's frankly where we are today. And then the other thing, I still carry on and have broadened, I think we might talk about, is more sort of standards type work.
Yeah. And it's fun now, finally, after all these years. Bluesound Professional is one of Copperleaf's clients, Copperleaf being the marketing PR company. It's actually really fun to be working with you and Kira on an ongoing basis. And as a client, I would actually really back up what you say. It's really good to have an agency to whom you don't have to explain all the technical stuff, and you can rely on them getting it at least basically right. And so that's actually fascinating. And having run marketing departments for manufacturers, that's always a challenge. How technical is your marketing department? And where does marketing stop and product management start in a company? So it's
Indeed
really an interesting and fun kind of evolution that we're now working together. You mentioned
indeed.
Something we did a few years ago when I was at Biamp, which I think we'll probably come and talk a little bit more about when we talk about trends. But another part that was interesting, and you and I have had a lot of conversations, often late night conversations, about kind of balancing your work as a AV consultant with your work for manufacturers. How have you found that to be over the years? It sounds like from what you said, the AV consultancy is kind of taking up more of your and Richard's time now. Is that right? And how has that balance been?
Well, I mean, Rich was full time on the consultancy. He does provide technical input to Copperleaf. He will read stuff and check if it's technically correct and things like that. But he's very much, independent of it, and deliberately so. I split my time. I'd like to say it's 50-50, but it varies hugely, and it just seems to work. And the manufacturers sort of understand there is a separation. I think I've been around long enough and have trusted long enough that I respect NDAs and all of that, and they know I live and die by that. So that's never really been a problem. Yeah.
So now, are we up to the current day now?
Yeah, pretty much. The consulting and the marketing company, carrying on. Yeah.
Okay, so you're almost uniquely positioned to talk about some of the things that will occupy kind of the second half of this conversation, which is where the industry is now, what the future of the industry is, the trends that you see within the industry. So I'm going to let you really talk about what interests you at the moment and what you're tracking at the moment in terms of where the industry's going?
Yeah, I mean, for someone who does a lot of stuff with standards, there's a difference between what's interesting and what's important. because because some of the stuff I'm doing isn't interesting, but it is really, really important. I mean, one of the things that is, if it's not hitting people already, is about to become a headache, is cybersecurity and security in general. There's some new legislation next year in the EU, but it will obviously roll out everywhere because they're not going to have different products for different regions, called the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act. And any product that is networked, or that even that you plug a computer in to configure, has to have a number of provisions to make it more secure, which is obviously, blindingly obvious in today's world with, hackers all over the place trying to make mincemeat of anything they possibly can. I mean, this is something I've written about for years. I mean, I wrote a blog piece in 2008, which was fictitious, about the new audio network at the European Union being invaded by hackers and the automatic translation machines. I write quite a lot of articles that are written in the future, and this was, and which then caused a war. But actually, not so silly that could happen if you've got you're relying on everything being networked and hacking into auto translation and insults exchanged and that sort of stuff. So, and that was 2008, and actually we still don't have properly encrypted audio networks. To me, that's just insane. So that's important. People aren't putting enough thought and care into it, and unfortunately, sometimes it's carrot and sometimes it's stick, and in this case with the EU, it's stick, and frankly quite necessary. There's some stuff with it that's important. I mean, some is obvious, like you don't have default passwords and that sort of stuff. But some of it is difficult because you have to have, for every product, what's called a software bill of materials. So you have to sort of say where you got all your code from. And of course, everybody's sharing libraries and there's GitHub and things like that. So I'm expecting some massive changes to GitHub where there's then, repositories not only of the code, but repositories of where that code came from and why it's okay and things like that. So I think that's going to affect a lot of things. Inevitably, just straight encryption will be important as well. However, what it also does is I think it's going to affect product life cycles, because one of the problems of the CRA is if you have a product out now, it's a legacy product, the new legislation won't apply to it, but your new product brought out in 2028 will apply. That's easy. However, if you do a software update to your product after the date, which is any new feature, so you could do a security update, but if it's anything that actually changes what the product does, suddenly it's considered to be a new product. And so therefore you've got to make the whole thing CRA compliant. Well, my guess would be in most cases, manufacturers aren't going to bother doing that with a product that's already out because it would be a pain. So it might mean a whole lot of products that we expect to get software updates from, manufacturers will just stop doing it for a while, or will be forced to buy new products and things like that. So I'm interested in how product life cycle is going to change, both pre and post. And obviously 5-6 years time, it won't matter. Everything will be CRA compliant. But during this transition period of 3-4 years, I think that's going to be I think detrimental.
That's there's lots to cover there as well. So the first thing I think is you mentioned it's the EU, which is obviously a very important market for every manufacturer, every global manufacturer. And you mentioned, that it will widen, but I'm interested in that because one of the things I'm very interested in is TDM laws, text and data mining laws in AI, and the EU has decent TDM laws. Germany has very good TDM laws, but the UK and the US don't. That hasn't propagated out, partly for political reasons. I think both the UK and the US government are setting themselves up to be like AI havens, but do you think in this case that it will propagate out, that those governments will say, you know what, this is important to us as well?
No, I don't think it's anything to do with the governments because it's hardware. It's just built into the hardware. You've got to have COA compliant product in the EU, therefore it will get sold. It'd be the same with RoHS, the RoHS
Mhm.
directive, which was removing some nasty chemicals from the products.
Mhm.
You know, in most cases, there weren't the products being sold in the EU without the nasty chemicals in and whatever. They just changed their processes, and everybody was the beneficiary of that, including Americans. So I think there's a difference between, certainly with the CRA, with what's physical product and what is software product. So yeah, where with software product you can make those decisions in a more agile way, but with hardware you can't. You're not going to have two production lines or two code
That's
bases or anything
true
like that.
if you're a global manufacturer, but there's
Indeed, yeah.
still exists, particularly in the US, that which has such a large home market. There are still lots of manufacturers that don't really look outside the borders. And anyway, so that was the first thing, whether it'll propagate out, and you make a good point there. The second thing is, our industry. So we at Bluesound Pro do some very large deployments and get involved in a lot of this security work as something that is table stakes really. And we're not perfect, by the way, definitely not perfect. Better than others, but not perfect. We have a lot of work to do as well. But our industry is not well prepared for something like this. How do you think it's gonna be carnage, isn't it?
Um, I mean, I don't know. People, I genuinely don't know. I think it depends on how, quickly authorities act. I mean, technically, if you're found to be non-compliant, the fines are just, you know, beyond punitive. I mean, insanely punitive. Um, I suspect sanity will prevail, and grace periods and warnings and things like that will happen. But, inevitably it all will start appearing in specs.
Mhm.
That's the thing that drives it more than the legislation, is the fact that in the product specs, for a project, people will say, all products must be COA compliant. You must do this, and you'll have to declare it. So I think I I'm not necessarily predicting, carnage, but in terms of people being fined so they go out of business and such like, but more the fact that this sort of resignation, oh, we really got to do this. I mean, it was the same, as I said, with the RoHS directive, of people
Mhm.
having to, change production lines and,
Yeah.
remove lead. And just that was, well, you were more on the hardware manufacturing at the time. I can
Yep.
imagine
Yep.
that being a
That
complete
was the
pain.
that was the thing, and it drove positive change.
Indeed.
And in fact, in our case at Biamp at the time, it drove a complete change in the way we made products, which we needed to do anyway, and that was a really good kind of stepping point to do it because we had to change everything anyway to take lead out of the process, and it allowed us to do some other things. It was a really good stepping point. The other point you made was something that I'm not even sure whether our industry has got its head around properly yet, which is that we are a software-driven industry now. We still think of ourselves as a hardware-driven industry, and we still monetize our products as if we're a hardware-driven industry. But we
Yeah.
are a software-driven industry, and as you say, a new product is not necessarily a new box, but a new set of functionality within software. And it is an interesting point that you make, that it might inhibit innovation in the sense that people will not do that anymore because it'll make them compliant to something they don't want to be compliant with, at least in this transition time.
Yeah.
And that's interesting in the sense that it might, like, I believe there was a real innovation pause after the pandemic for a couple of reasons. One, I really believe that you need to be in the same room as other people to truly get innovation, and remote work is really good for productivity but not great for innovation. And
Yep.
so there was a lack of innovation because there was a lack of in-person stuff, but also because of the supply chain issues and manufacturers having to engineer products, the same products around different components that they could get, has led for several years that I think we're just getting out of now, to this kind of innovation pause where we're not seeing the new products and the new functionality that we should be, and this could lead to another one of those just at the point.
I definitely they'll no question. I can see them doing you can only put so much development time into things, and they will do the stuff they have to do legally at the expense of fancy new features and things. No question.
Interesting. Before we get off legislation, you were talking about before we went on air about Martyn's Law, which was something I didn't know about, and I think it would be good for you to enlighten us on that one as well.
Yeah, this is UK only, but there's no question that other governments are, looking closely at this. This is a new piece of legislation that comes in next April, which means that any public event above 200 people and above 800 people, you have to put physical changes in place, has to have provision for mitigation and protection during a terrorist incident. And so what that means is it could be evacuation, but it could also be lockdown and also even evacuation. And to do that, you have to have a communication plan. Well, communication, that to me says audio, because if you're going to take a venue and lock the doors and keep people in for their own safety, you better tell them what's going on. Otherwise, you'll have a riot on your hands. And so I'm involved that very, very closely now. And we're actually just started. We had our first meeting last month, just starting to write a new standard on how you will go about designing and operating and conceiving and managing a sound system for use during a terrorist incident, which is obviously a modification of what you've already got there, but you may find it has to go to places such as staff areas you never anticipated, or outdoor areas where people might congregate and things like that. So it's raising, already a whole load of questions. We were talking about, because obviously there's conventional voice alarm systems for use in fire, and then we're discussing, will they go off automatically when a bunch of detectors go off? Okay, so how are we going to stop it going off automatically if a terrorist deliberately triggers to something to be like a fire as a false alarm and things like that? So it's already becoming something complex to do, but it will mean there will be extra sound in venues that was unexpected. Above 800 people, as I said, they expect physical changes. There's obviously related to access control, CCTV. I mean, the security industry will be a huge beneficiary of this. And so, I've suddenly found myself very much at the center of that. And it'll be interesting to see, obviously, I hope within a year, what we have. But inevitably, other countries, will look at what we've done and I think start to implement it, because frankly that was very similar with the British with voice alarm standards from the 80s. Is they became the original, in some ways the gold standard, that were then adopted elsewhere. So that's again important work, but not necessarily in itself interesting work, but needs doing.
Well, it's interesting in the sense that, like the voice alarm changes, it's an opportunity for our industry. As you say, it's extra sound equipment in many cases. But when you were talking about it and talking about lockdown and things, and when we were talking beforehand as schools being potentially one of those places, I wonder how much has already been done over here in the US, because that's so much more of a day-to-day thing, an ever-present threat. So will you in the UK kind of look to what's happening over here in terms of lockdown procedures and, as you say, evacuation procedures? Because kind of it's what we deal with every day here.
Yes, no, and we're due to be speaking to various people on your side of the pond about that, no question, because there's certainly lessons to be learned. And one of the things that really struck me, it was from conversation quite a few years ago. I was on one standards committee, and we did a trip to the Stade de France, which is the premier stadium in Paris. And I met the sound engineer who was on duty the night in November 2015, where there were the terrorist attacks across France, and they had a match going on that night, and the French president was present in the stadium. And he was part of the people that were making the decision to lock the doors, which they'd never done before. And you're looking, goodness knows how many tens of thousands of people in, and then tell them to keep calm and tell them what's going on, which is a very unusual thing, to happen in Europe, that you have to do that. And without question, lives were saved. And the conversation I had with him, it clearly that night had changed his life. And you could see that, even this was a couple of years later, was affected by that, by that evening. And I think that's something that struck with me, so that when, and ever since, I've always mentioned in systems I'm designing for life safety, I've mentioned terrorism provision as well as just evacuation in terms of fire, and the fact that we're doing this work to create a standard based on some legislation to do with that is a nice way to me of squaring that circle from the conversation I had with him all those years ago.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because we forget in all of this. And I remember that night, actually. I was watching that game, and I remember it happening. And we forget about the humans that have to make these decisions. I mean, if we think back to, say, Hillsborough and the tragedy that emerged there, I'm sure there are a number of human beings whose lives, who had to make decisions, and in that case probably made the wrong ones, whose lives have been forever changed. And hopefully, if there's legislation that can make that a more structured process and prepare people. I mean, you don't think of a sound engineer at a stadium as having to make a decision that might save tens of thousands of people's lives. And that's a really fascinating point, and that must have been a really interesting discussion.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. So yes, so some of the work I do, as I said, and I'm working on other standards committees as well. It's important, but it's, again, I'm not trying to say a legacy, but it's stuff that will last many years, and frankly, also not enough people want to do it and get involved. So it's a good opportunity. If you do want to be involved, you will make a difference.
Yeah, I think I'm one of those people that don't particularly want to be involved in standards, but I am incredibly grateful that there are people like you that do embrace it. So let's move on and talk about some of the other trends that are not so based on legislation. What else are you seeing in the industry?
I think the thing I'm really noticing is a maturing of DSP. There are more DSP platforms available, I think, than ever, from more companies. The barrier to entry isn't as horrendous as it was, at all levels, from the cheap end even to the high end. In some cases, there's really only been one, maybe two choices of what you use on a certain project. That is now changing rapidly, where certainly next year, if I'm doing some of the largest projects available, I'll certainly have a choice of 3, if not 4 different platforms, whereas previously really just one. So that's great. The fact that there's a move to software-only solutions, that if you trust it, which more and more people do, you can just run on any old PC, not a manufacturer-approved PC, any old PC. That technology is coming over from the broadcast industry, which I think bodes well, because I think generally people like us who've come from either live sound or installed sound, you go, well, if it works on broadcast, it must be okay, because there's something, inherent warm feeling about the fact that if it's done TV or radio, it must be okay. So there's technologies we've seen there that they're basically reskinning this stuff that's doing crazy amounts of channels and broadcast setups in software. It's just a reskin to make it work for our industry. And so, yeah, that's I think a really important trend. Inevitably, there will be cloud-based DSP as well, where latency, and it doesn't matter. And we were talking about this before we went on air as well. Yes, obviously within the room, and certainly obviously within a live event, you have to process there. But outside of that, a small amount of latency really doesn't matter. And therefore, so why are you paying for it all the time when you don't need it, when you only need it for a couple of hours a day or something like that? So all of that maturity I see coming together.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned broadcast, and one of the trends in the industry, which is interesting to me, kind of as an outsider looking in, is the convergence of broadcast and installed AV. As more and more companies put in broadcast studios, content creation studios, it's kind of like almost broadcast comes down to a prosumer level. How do you see that trend?
Yeah, massive. I mean, the pandemic accelerated it, but it was happening anyway. I mean, even things like when the CEO wanted to do an all hands call, they would sit like this behind a computer. Well, now they don't. They're standing in a studio, and it's like a TV show.
Yeah.
Houses of worship, again, when they needed to sort of reach out to the congregation who couldn't necessarily go because of COVID. Well, they've now, a number of them, a huge number of them, have turned into broadcasters, where, as well as the the live action within the building itself, they're broadcasting out, streaming it out, so they have a separate control room with the camera control and things like that. So we're seeing it in venues as well. I'm involved with a local venue where I've had conversations about the fact that where there aren't rights issues, and this is a grassroots venues where there's fewer rights issues, well, why aren't we just working on streaming it out to the world? We're not trying to say you don't need to come. The people who are going to come locally are still going to come, but to make other people aware of that venue for potentially additional revenue, or people who then go, well, it's not that far away, I might come. And it's affordable now, to become a broadcaster. So yeah, definite blurring between what is a broadcast and what is a even a meeting.
And that's an interesting trend. You mentioned the venue. It immediately made me think of Ted and Chris Anderson and what he did by saying, you know what, we have this elite tech conference that 1,000 people come to. We're going to broadcast the talks. We're just going to, throw it open so anyone in the world can watch it. And everyone said to him, you're mad. People are paying insane amounts of money to go to this elite conference. And now you're saying anyone can see it. But of course, as we know, that just increased the allure of TED, and people wanted more and more to come and be a part of it. And then obviously he then said, okay, you can have your own TED. You can have TEDx's, and there's 1,600 of those around the world. And all of that continued to build the brand. So it's interesting the way that a brave decision, rather than just thinking we cannot share this because we might negatively impact ourselves, leading to these kind of silos. If people are brave enough and say, you know what, we'll stream it, we'll broadcast it, we'll let other people see it. Usually it positively impacts the people that make those brave decisions.
Indeed. Sort of related to this, when I was looking at other forms of live entertainment, what makes a live event, and I deliberately, for a magazine I was writing for, wrote a clickbait headline when ABBA Voyage came out in London, which, for those that don't know, you basically see ABBA as, it's not holograms, but for the sake of this conversation, as holograms, and there's a live band. And I wrote, did ABBA just kill tribute bands? And actually then you start peeling the onion on that, and actually it's going to go both ways, because I think people still want to go to a gig and jockey next to people and hear a sound, and if a good tribute band can do that, that will continue. But in the world of people buying not only the recording catalog of artists, but inevitably those contracts will move to, well, we will have your visual image as part of that thing, so we can create gigs in the future long after you're dead, or just have decided you don't want to tour, that they can then reproduce ABBA Voyages of that band. But what you do is you're not necessarily just looking at a screen, because it's owned by those people who own the rights. You have in the entrance area a museum of all their different costumes over the years, or things like that, to also encourage and also, frankly, you can then get bands to venues that they wouldn't otherwise go to. But in order to do that, you need some sort of standardization of systems to know that your, for what a better word, holographic system will work. Well, what are venues that have got lots of video technology and lots of sound that are used to adhering to standards? Oh, that'll be cinemas then. So what you're likely to have, I think, is one of the screens at a cinema becoming, if you like, the live music venue, hosting these virtual events, but they might even have, some live musicians and, as I said, certainly space for, in experience and merchandise and things like that, beyond the conventional cinematic experience. But I don't think that necessarily kills also the live music venue doing traditional music either. So I've always had an interest in exploring where those things might go.
This is a fascinating kind of rabbit hole to dive down, and I think I can't resist doing it. So certainly, you mentioned name, image, likeness, and there are name, image, likeness deals going on now. KISS have just done one, and obviously that's part of the ABBA thing, and I agree with you. ABBA Voyage is, I would suspect, increasing the demand for ABBA tribute bands, because it's increasing the relevance of ABBA in the world at large. But what I really want to dive down into, and I get where you're going with cinemas, but I don't think it's the answer. But it is something I'm really fascinated by, because as tours become bigger and bigger, and as it started with the work that Patrick Woodruff and Mark Fisher did with U2 and the Stones, where, tours becoming bigger things, and it's current state of the art is someone like Adele, that's almost like a modern day circus, taking around a complete venue with them, and obviously the Taylor Swift Eras tour. You've got those tours can do less and less physical locations because they're more and more complex. So
yes,
you get a situation even in the States where maybe it's only 5 or 6 cities, and in European countries it might just be 1 city or 2 cities maybe. So what happens if you're in Portland, Oregon, where I am, and you're a Swiftie? Maybe you pay $5,000 and fly to LA for a few days and buy a really expensive ticket and kind of go to the gig. What I hear a lot of people talk about is live streaming and going to the gig in your house, but that loses all sense of community. And I agree with you with what you're saying, but I don't agree with the venue. So I think there is a space in between those where like 1,000 Swifties in Portland can have an experience that has community, has a merch table, has everything else, without having to go to LA.
But and the model of that, and the model of that already exists with sport, with fan zones.
Yes, and actually going on from there with COSM. So with this kind of experiential sports, and I actually think that's where the future is going. I really believe there is a open space for experiential venues with 360-degree video and audio, along the lines of mini spheres, of Lightroom, of Team Labs, of what COSM are doing in the sports environment. My friend John Cotton and Joe Hamilton are doing it in Planetaria, and that's another venue that has kind of certainly the video part well done. But I actually believe that there is really an open space for these immersive venues, more so than a cinema. I went to see the Peter Gabriel film that was one day. I went to see the Brian Eno generative film, and I like those events, but it's not experiential enough yet with one screen.
No, and you might be right about the venues. I mean, and again, this brings into another thing that actually we didn't discuss. We might talk about something I've been talking about as well is how to be greener, particularly with installs and live events. And there was some very interesting work done by the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, which is a clues in the name, climate research organization, that was paid for by the band Massive Attack on decarbonising live music. And one of the statements they said, a huge simplification, but basically saying, why are a bunch of trucks crisscrossing the country with the same gear in them, which they sort of are. And what I then did was started to look at that, and again, in an article and another article I wrote, several years in the future, where, well, how does that affect installs? Because if you're going to have venues where you've got better in-house stuff, so you don't need to truck so much around, well, they better be done to a higher standard. And then, well, who decides what a higher standard is? And are you going to have A venues, B venues, C venues, and only the certain manufacturers that we all know get the top ones, or will there be some independent adjudication that decides that that brand is okay in that venue, and therefore these bands will appear at that? Will there be more use of video instead of sets? All of those kind of things. And I created this fictitious piece of legislation called the one truck rule, where basically any tour had to fit in one truck and everything else had to be done locally. And you can force people into doing that. And then, what you do is, if you are going to bring everything in, well, you cluster your events. So you have a heavy metal month, and it's appropriately decked out, and then an opera month and things like that. And actually, I spoke to Brian Raven, who I don't know if you know, but was managing director of White Light for White Light, the big lighting company, for many years, and he said, actually, we've started doing that. They've started clustering similar types of events, and but inevitably, we're going to have to start shifting less equipment around, and by definition, that will lead to more installs. And I even, I've said this, I love going to festivals. I always go to a festival once a year. Frankly, you can't justify them. Environmentally, they are completely unjustifiable. The waste, still the use of generators, the rubbish, and just the sheer transport. The largest use of carbon emissions for any live event is the public getting there. You can complain about the band floating around in private jets, which of course they wouldn't do, and the optics isn't good, but actually it's a fraction of a percent in comparison to the CO2 from the audience traveling. And and again, I joked, in the future, a country, or maybe a state, in a larger country such as yours, will have a fixed place for festivals. And every month a different festival goes there, but it has built-in plumbing, it has its own solar and wind generation that then benefits the local residents, give them free power for the disturbance that they get, all of those sort of things, because it's the only way, actually, if we really want to face up to it, to make those things truly sustainable, is to actually turn a festival into a venue.
We're working on just such a thing in Portland at the moment. And I'll talk to you more about that next week at Infocom. This is kind of, and I'd love to talk to you for hours, and there's so many things that we talked about talking about that we haven't got around to. But I do want to get your opinion on, we're talking about experiential and the really kind of fun, sexy part of our industry, which is, how do you create these immersive experiences? And it's long been, and increasingly been, my theory that the industry is bifurcating, with that at one end, and this kind of dash to the UCC kind of lowest common denominator huddle room, huge volume, really low margin, commodification. Do you see the same thing?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And it's fundamentally, you can go whichever way you want. It's about being brave. Do you want an interesting life or not? Mm-hmm. And there are some integrators, and there's one integrator I can think of in particular, who are just doing interesting work because they're choosing to work with creatives, sell themselves as creatives, and even with some of the corporate environments they're doing, they are creative spaces. Even if it's for sort of a team of lawyers, there's like crazy stuff going on, because everybody likes to be entertained and engaged, not just people who are pure creatives. And yes, there are other people who are just more interested in the AV being a commodity, and
Mhm.
let's get another job over the line. How are this year's sales figures looking? There's no excitement to any of it. Yes, we might use a newer fangled beamforming microphone or something like that, but nothing that moves the needle. And as you say, inevitably, all you get there is a price going down and down and down for a service that I think it'll always be needed, but it'll sort of almost be seen a bit like security equipment in the end. That's like a grudge buy. What do you mean?
Mhm.
I've got to have someone to install it? Oh, I suppose so.
Mhm.
But they're not bringing anything to it other than function.
Yeah, and I mean, who is that person installing it? As it becomes easier and easier to do, it's less and less likely to be an AV professional. And
Yep.
we already have this. I mean, we're currently doing a project where there's 100 stores a day being installed. We did one, for 7-Eleven where it was 85 stores. Now we're doing one. There's 100 stores a day and bigger stores, and that's got to be a low touch installation. It's got to be a get in, do it, get out. A world away from the work that you were doing with the Dome and with the Olympics, and the experiential end of the industry, which is super specialized. So it's interesting. You said if you want an interesting life, and it's very clear from talking to you in the first half of this podcast that you have had a really interesting life in this industry by being curious, by being brave in order to follow the opportunities as they present themselves. That's, I think, really inspiring. I've tried to do the same thing, and I think that's really inspiring. We're going to have to wrap it up. I'm going to do a second episode with you because there are so many other things I want to talk about with you. So I will be inviting you back to a future episode. But I would like to ask you if you have any last comments, and I want to really phrase those around something we could have talked about for the whole thing, and we've almost totally skirted around, which is AI and how you see AI influencing our industry in a few minutes.
I think other than people using it to help check their grammar and proposals and things like that, none of this is moving as quickly as I think either of us thought it would. But it's definitely coming. I mean, to me, initiatives like Open AV Cloud are inevitable, and using model context protocols to enable systems to be set up and controlled in an agile manner, where literally you can add extra gear in the next day and you haven't got to get a new programmer in. It just, there's a new piece of gear here today, right, we'll deal with that this time. It's inevitable. There's other initiatives. There's a company I'm aware of that are apparently going to be turning the creation of plugins into minutes as opposed to hours. Also, just the ability to aggregate data. Whereas previously we were concerned with, let's look at the how we're going to control this piece of AV gear and AV gear and this, that, and the other. The fact that it is literally no more work now to introduce weather data or power consumption data or just these other sources of information that surround us, lets you add so much more finesse to an install. The fact that you'll be able to automatically count the number of people in the room, that sort of stuff. So it's coming, but I think not as quickly as I think either of us expected. I was expecting sort of an Open AV Cloud thing to sort of be here now, and it isn't. What you have now are people who are doing traditional control systems using AI to help complete their code more quickly. That's definitely happening. The programmer we use for most of that stuff is, but I'm not seeing anything more than that at the moment. And of course, there's also the difference between agentic and generative AI. And I was at a seminar a few weeks ago talking about that. And agentic, it's automation really, and we've had automation for decades, and it's fine, and no one's worried about it really. And also small language models. People are talking about the large language models. So we were talking about the concept of just a mixing console. But it doesn't need everything. But if you have a small language model for that and give it some very specific confines, then it can be done, on the machine itself. You haven't got to worry about connectivity or latency. But again, we're not seeing that quite yet.
Yeah, and I think small language models, we will definitely see them for. I mean, you talked about cybersecurity and that kind of protection. We're seeing it certainly what I might call medium-sized models within enterprises, and yes, certainly small language models in specific pieces of gear, and how those different scales fit together, kind of small to medium to large. Kind of similar parallels to how we're going to use the cloud and what's appropriate to do locally, and what's appropriate to do at distance, and what's appropriate to do in low resolution locally, and high resolution at distance. I remember talking 15 years ago to Autodesk about this, to do with Revit and how you do kind of high res 3D modeling in the cloud and buying time on their servers, this 15 years ago, versus a low res model that can be done locally on your computer.
Indeed. And what I would say to that, not necessarily AI, but in terms of just having access to insane amounts of computing power for short periods of time, I think something that we're going to see completely revolutionized very soon is acoustic modeling. Because at the moment, we have to put in, frankly, very basic wireframes. And if you make it even remotely complicated, the software falls over and it can't cope with it. Whereas I'm pretty sure we'll see wireframes where, down to, the few square centimeters or inches will be modeled for each facet, and, just an order of magnitude more accuracy over how accurate those computer models will be for audio, which will then inevitably be using AI and other automation techniques to add a finesse in terms of positioning and EQing and everything way, way, way beyond what we have now.
So any last thoughts or things you'd like to say that you haven't said already?
I think the only thing is, again, this has been somewhat reflective. I've certainly been, I would say I've been lucky, and I would really also want to thank the industry I work in. It's always been pretty kind to me, and there have been people who have on a number of occasions just given me a rope to hang myself on, which I'm forever grateful. And I think if there's anything, if there's people new to the industry watching this, and something again I'm involved with is training people, who and trying to get people into the industry and to understand it, is you do need mentors. And for those of us who are a bit older and a bit more experienced, we should find people to mentor, and that's, I think, again, something that I'm quite passionate about.
Yeah, likewise, and that's a really interesting point, because people talk about how difficult it is to get people into the industry, and part of that is, if the industry is hanging a display in a soundbar, then I'm not surprised. It's not super sexy to get into, but this question of mentoring is a really important one. I've talked to people that say that it's difficult for people to find people to mentor them. And, I'm like, well, I'm actually older than you. so, and I've been incredibly fortunate in the same way as you to have people all the way through my career. And I love doing it for other people. So the difficulty is connecting those people that need mentoring with those people that would only be too happy to spend some time mentoring people. And I wonder what we can do in the industry to make that process kind of more frictionless.
Indeed.
It's a really interesting topic to end with. So how do people get in touch with you?
Well, it depends which hat I'm wearing. On the consultancy side, anything sort of all things sort of audio, whether it's system design or product development or compliance, it's rhconsulting.uk. And if you want to ever talk about marketing and things like that within the sort of technology space, it's copperleaf.media.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Roland. And it's always a pleasure to chat to you, because we always cover things that just get me thinking. Thank you for listening to us. And there will be new episodes every week. You can find us on your normal podcast platforms, on Apple, on Spotify, whatever, on YouTube, because this is a video podcast. Please subscribe. You can also find us at surroundscapes.bluesoundprofessional.com. That's maybe your best way of finding us and digging into the 7 series of Surroundscapes that we've done before this one. Thank you again, and see you next week.